I learned a lot about bourbon working in US liquor, speaking with importers on work withs, standing next to brands at festivals and chatting to retailers and other liquor reps across America. In Europe and the UK, you don't really appreciate the scale of bourbon's rise in the last couple of decades, only seen through a narrow lens of small number of big brands. So the things you need to know. Let's dive in. Hello, Hendo here, and welcome to What You Need to Know About Bourbon Whiskey 2021. In this video, we will explore the rise of bourbon whiskey in more detail. To learn more about the drinks industry and brand marketing from a global perspective, please like this video, subscribe, but also check out hendotalks.com if you're interested in speaker services or events. In June 2018, I was standing in a liquor store in the Netherlands. The day the EU 25% tariff on US whiskey and bourbon came into force, the influential store owner told me his orders would drop immediately. A day after, I arrived in the Midwest USA for a whiskey fair. US craft distillers told me they were ripping up their export plans. It was very stark. Now you only see a few bourbon brands in Europe. It's a shame really when politics gets in the way of whiskey lovers. I've had to bring back bottles in a suitcase each trip so I could enjoy these whiskies with friends. In the US liquor stores you'll see aisles and aisles of bourbon whiskey. So let's get into what's going on. I'll cover the history in another video, but for now it's production and labelling, the players, politics and the state of play. On May the 4th, 1964, Congress declared bourbon America's native spirit. All bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. Bourbon is defined by law: number 1, made in the United States of America; number 2, product from a fermented mash of at least 51% corn; number 3, distilled at no more than 160 proof; number 4, stored at no more than 125 proof in new charred oak barrels; number 5, aged for a minimum of 2 years; and number 6, free from additives, apart from water to dilute down, of course. Then there's Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, which simply tells you it's made in Kentucky state. Now, although bourbon can be made anywhere in the US, Kentucky is known as the birthplace of bourbon, producing 95% of the world's supply, around 200 Kentucky bourbons and more than 20 working bourbon distilleries in Kentucky. Now, brand differentiation is as much to do with age in the barrel, with production being so similar. In Kentucky, so much is resold, relabeled and hidden in marketing. KDA is Kentucky Distillers Association, a non-profit trade group founded in 1880 and now represents 40 companies. KDA promotes Kentucky as an authentic home for bourbon. Kentucky distillers filled more than 2.1 million barrels of bourbon in 2019, 10 million aging barrels, more than double the population of the state. Now on to production and labelling. The mash is the baseline mixture of water steeped with grains. The mash bill is the ratio of grains used. Bourbon has to be at least 51% corn and a period of aging in charred new oak barrels, not used casks like Scotch. New charred oak, heavy vanillin aromas, and after about 12 years the wood starts to take over. Now, wheated bourbons like Pappy Van Winkle, produced at Buffalo Trace Distillery. After corn, wheat is the secondary grain favoured rather than rye or barley in the recipe. Wheated bourbon tends to be a smoother spirit. Exact same mash bill and the same distillery as Pappy is W.L. Weller bourbon, well worth trying. Char levels is how long the barrel has been fired or toasted before liquid is added. Level 1 to 4 is the most common, and with level 1 char barrels being toasted for 15 seconds and level 4 up to 55 seconds. Bottled in bond, this means the spirit must be aged for at least 4 years and bottled at precisely 100 proof, which is 50% ABV. Single barrel means the bourbon has been aged in only one type of barrel before it's sold. So quite different from single cask in whiskey, where it's from one cask. Single barrel are typically more expensive because they can only be run in limited batches. Then small batch refers to bourbons made up of a small selection of different casks married together to create like a recipe. Small batch bourbon can be a mix of anywhere between 5 and 100 barrels. In the US, you'll also hear private barrel programs where liquor store owners or buyers will go to Kentucky and select barrels for their store, and gives them something unique and special to give their customers. Private barrel selection is also a premium product. Now, sourcing is a hot topic. To open a distillery and age spirit is expensive. Michter's took 8 years and $8 million to build a distillery in Louisville. So many brands skip it by sourcing to raise capital. It's an open secret that many craft distilleries buy and bottle their whiskey from an Indiana factory called Midwest Grain Products, MGP. Non-distiller producers, NDPs, that buy its whiskey like this from a menu NGP Indiana distillers bottles house label. Bourbon labelling is regulated by TTB, Labelling, Alcohol and Tobacco Trade Bureau, but they're short in resources to enforce it and trying to modernise to improve transparency in the industry. You can search a public website, COLA database maintained by the TTB for label approvals to find out more on a specific brand's heritage. Now to the players. Sazerac Company has over 450 alcohol brands and owns Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. Famous bourbons like Pappy Van Winkle, W.A. Weller, E.H. Taylor, Eagle Rare, Blanton's 1792 bourbon, George T. Stagg and Stagg Jr. Willett has Willett's Pot Still, Old Bardstown, Rowan's Creek, Noah's Mill. Beam Suntory has Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, Basil Hayden's, Old Grandad. Heaven Hill has Old Fitzgerald, Henry McKenna, Elijah Craig, Heaven Hill, Evan Williams. The Brown Foreman has Old Forester and Woodford Reserve. Campari has Wild Turkey and Russell's Reserve. And Pernod Ricard has Jefferson's and TX. Diageo has Bullet Bourbon made at the Four Roses Distillery in Lawrenceburg. Four Roses Distillery is owned by Kirin, a Japanese brewer. Michter's is owned by Joe Maglio. Now, what is the difference between bourbon and Tennessee whiskey? Well, Tennessee whiskey is covered by the federal codes to be a bourbon, then undergoes the Lincoln County process, an additional step of hard sugar maple charcoal filtration. By law, it must be a bourbon, but then charcoal mellowed in Tennessee. Jack Daniels has a lower rye percentage content than Kentucky bourbon, so less bold, peppery, more sweet and oaky. That's the difference. The bourbon boom has been massive due to well-timed industry investments over the last couple of decades. Kentucky distillers watched from afar as California's wine industry flourished and the rise of Scotch whisky. They wanted to build their own success story, and so gaining from years of zero export tariffs, 98% growth between 2010 and 2017, they spent a fortune building multi-million dollar visitor centres, increasing volumes, and turned Kentucky into a world-class tourist destination. The Kentucky Bourbon Trail was created. US craft distillers were given tax cut incentives and distilleries swelled to 2,000 across America. Not all bourbon, of course. In addition is the rise of cocktail culture, on-premise as the craft distillers, they can get supported as they start to grow their brands through the bars and restaurants. You start to see also the trend of cigar smoking coming back in the US goes very well with bourbon. In the fashion of TV, Mad Men shows, things like that. These all had an influence in boosting the bourbon trend. But then trade wars halted export plans in 2018 and COVID-19 happened. On-premise shutdowns and restrictions. Craft distillers lost nearly $1 billion due to the pandemic. Events and festivals cancelled immediately. But at home, consumption, off-premise, bottle sales were up. US alcohol e-commerce jumped 42%, Drizzly up 350%. Plans for social distance, virtual tours and tastings. The Kentucky Bourbon Affair is cancelled, but 30th anniversary Kentucky Bourbon Festival looks like it's going ahead in September. Now, as off-trade premise, bourbon sales reach 1.34 billion 8 months into 2020, 30% increase from the previous year. The pivot to e-commerce and curbside delivery really ensured brand survival. Good news is the tariffs didn't go up in January 2021. Hope for vaccines and that the on-premise restaurants and bars will come back. The bourbon boom is still strong, growing faster than consumer goods just now. Changing demographics and tourists will be returning. Wealthier drinkers are turning to bourbon, so think of ultra premium. Women as well. Consumer insights from MRI Simmons reports an increase of black and Asian bourbon drinkers. So the future is bright for bourbon, as export tariffs are still a challenge and many brands will be desperate for the economy to be back on track with tourism, and growth is expected to continue for many more years to come. So over to you, tell us what you think of the bourbon whiskey scene just now. I will add some more videos on the subject, and if you're interested in whiskey projects, please contact us at hendotalks.com, and as always, welcome your feedback and comments. I hope this was useful to you in some way, and until next time, thanks very much for watching.